Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Have you ever wanted to see a bully HOA get exactly what's coming to them? I got a violation for my porch decor from an association I had zero connection to. Instead of arguing, I decided to see just how far they would push it. They pushed it all the way to a legal threat and walked right into the most perfectly documented trap I've ever set. I work in land use planning, have for about 12 years. My entire job is knowing where lines are drawn on maps, what those lines mean legally, and who has authority over what piece of ground. I say this not to brag, but because it matters a lot to this story. When I tell you I know property boundaries the way most people know their own phone number, I mean that literally. So when I bought my house 2 years ago, the absence of an HOA was not just a nice bonus. It was something I had confirmed in writing, triple-checked in the title documents, and personally verified against the county parcel database before I ever signed anything. I had spent years watching neighbors in HOA communities fight over fence heights and paint colors and whether a basketball hoop constituted a permanent structure. I wanted absolutely none of that. The lot I chose was at the very edge of a newer development, the last house on the street before a small stretch of trees separates it from the older, more established community that sits right next door. That older community has an HOA, a famously strict one according to people who knew the area. My development does not. The two neighborhoods sit back to back, almost touching, and if you did not know the history of how they were built, you might assume they were one continuous place. The street names are similar enough to cause confusion if you're not paying attention. The mailboxes for the end of my street cluster together near the same corner as the mailboxes for the beginning of their street. I noticed it the first week I moved in and thought it was a mildly interesting quirk of local planning. I did not think it would eventually become the centerpiece of one of the more satisfying experiences of my adult life. I moved in during late summer, spent the first couple of months getting the interior sorted out, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood, figuring out which neighbors wave and which ones don't. By the time early autumn rolled around, I was finally ready to make the outside feel like mine. I have always liked fall decorations, not the inflatable kind, not the ones with flashing lights and sound effects, just the classic, straightforward stuff. A few hay bales on either side of the front steps, some dried corn stalks tied to the porch columns, a wreath on the door, and a spread of pumpkins and gourds across the steps in different sizes and colors. It looked genuinely good. My wife and I stood in the driveway and agreed it was probably the nicest our porch had ever looked. 3 days later, something appeared in our mailbox. It was an envelope, business-sized, with an official return address from something called the Architectural Review Committee of the neighboring HOA community. At first, I thought it had been misdelivered. I turned it over and checked the address on the front. It had my address on it, my exact address, typed out correctly. I stood at the mailbox for a moment just staring at it, genuinely puzzled, then took it inside and opened it. It was a formal violation notice, typed up with a reference number at the top citing Article 7, Section 4 of their community bylaws. The violation category was listed as unapproved seasonal displays and agricultural elements. There was a grainy photograph printed at the bottom of the page. It had clearly been taken from across the street, or further away, zoomed in, and showed my porch decorations. The hay bales and corn stalks were circled in red marker. The notice demanded immediate removal of the offending items and informed me that a $50 fine had been assessed against my property. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the whole thing twice. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that because people always expect me to say I was furious. I wasn't. I was genuinely amused in the way you get when something is so fundamentally wrong that it almost loops back around to being impressive. These people had sent an official violation notice with a reference number and a cited bylaw and a fine to a property that was not under their authority in any way, shape, or form. My first instinct was to call them right away and explain the error. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. But I work in land use planning. I know how bureaucracies operate. I know that a phone call often gets lost, denied, or misremembered later. And something about the officiousness of that letter, the confidence of it, the red marker circles on the photograph made me curious about what would happen if I just waited. I wanted to see how far this would go if left unaddressed. I decided to give it 2 weeks and see. I told my wife what was happening. She laughed, then got slightly nervous, then laughed again when I explained that they had no actual authority over our property. I pulled up the county parcel map on my work laptop right there at the table and showed her exactly where the HOA boundary sat and exactly where our property sat in relation to it. There was no ambiguity at all. Our lot was not adjacent to the boundary, it was not close to the boundary. The boundary was a full street width and a line of trees away from us. We were, by any measure, completely outside their jurisdiction. My wife asked if we needed to do anything, and I told her not yet. I wanted to see what their next move was. I noted the date the violation notice arrived, put it in a folder, and went back to enjoying our porch. 2 weeks later, the second notice showed up. This one was more pointed. The fine had doubled to $100 for what they called failure to comply. The language had shifted from polite to firm. It referenced the original notice by reference number and made clear that continued non-compliance would result in further escalation. There was no new photograph this time, just a terse paragraph about the seriousness of ignoring official HOA communications and a reminder that their enforcement authority was backed by legal mechanisms. I decided it was time to respond, but not to reveal anything, not to explain myself, not directly. What I drafted instead was a very short, very polite, very carefully worded letter. I wrote that I had received their notices regarding my property and that I genuinely wanted to make sure I was fully compliant with all relevant rules. I explained that in reviewing my closing documents, I had been unable to locate any governing covenants that applied to my parcel, and I asked them to please provide me with a copy of their CC and Rs that explicitly listed my parcel number as being under their jurisdiction. I kept the tone cooperative and almost apologetic in its politeness. I gave no indication that I already knew the answer. I gave no indication that I was anything other than a confused new homeowner trying to do the right thing. I sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. I kept a copy of the letter and a copy of the certified tracking number, and when the green return receipt card came back a few days later confirming delivery and a signature, I added it to the folder. That card was going to matter a lot later. Then I waited again. No response came to my request, not a word. No documentation, no explanation, no acknowledgement that they had even received or read the question. Nothing came back at all. What came instead, about 3 weeks later, was a third violation notice. By that point, autumn had given way to early winter and I had swapped out the fall decorations for something more seasonal. Classic white string lights along the porch railing, nothing dramatic. The kind every hardware store moves by the millions this time of year, and a small spotlight shining on a wireframe reindeer figure I had put on the lawn, the simple kind that looks like it was assembled from a kit in about 15 minutes. The new violation notice cited these as unapproved holiday lighting and unauthorized lawn ornaments respectively. The fines were accumulating fast. The total across all 3 notices was somewhere above $300. The tone had shifted again with this one, mentioning further legal action and the possibility of assessment liens if the matter remained unresolved. I put the third notice in the folder with the others and continued to not pay a single cent. A few evenings after that third notice arrived, I was sitting in the living room after dinner when I noticed movement across the street. A golf cart had stopped at the curb. A woman climbed out, stood on the public sidewalk, and held up her phone toward my house. She took several photos, pausing between each one to review the screen, repositioning herself a little, then taking more. She was methodical about it. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm that she kept shifting around as she moved. She stood out there for a few minutes, then got back into the golf cart and drove off in the direction of the neighboring community. I did not go outside. I watched from the window without doing anything that might look like I was watching. After she left, I noted the time and added it to the notes section of my folder. Up to that point, the whole thing had felt somewhat abstract, a clerical error that snowballed because someone in a minor position of authority could not be bothered to verify their own records. Watching that woman stand on the sidewalk photographing my house changed the feel of it. This was not administrative sloppiness anymore. This was someone personally invested in bringing me into line, someone who had received my certified letter asking for basic proof of jurisdiction and had apparently decided that ignoring the question and escalating further was the correct move. Whatever she believed about her authority over my property, she believed it deeply and was willing to spend her evenings out there in a golf cart enforcing it. I kept the folder updated and waited for whatever came next. I want to be honest here and say that part of me had started hoping they would push further, because the more they escalated, the stronger my eventual response was going to be. Every new notice, every new fine, every bit of additional documentation they sent me was another piece of evidence that this was a sustained, deliberate pattern and not a single careless mistake. By the time that fourth communication arrived, I had a folder full of material that painted a very clear picture. What came next arrived about a month after the third violation notice, and it did not come from the Architectural Review Committee this time. It came from the HOA's property management company, the outside firm that handles the administrative and legal side of things for the community. The letter was formal in a way the previous ones had not been, more legalistic in its phrasing. It described itself as a final notice before lien proceedings, and stated that if the accumulated fines, now totaling over $500, were not paid in full within 30 days, the HOA would initiate the process of placing a lien on my property. A lien on my property for corn stalks and string lights and a wireframe reindeer on a property that was not in their HOA. I read that letter 3 times. I set it on the desk and sat with it for a while. Then I went to my home office, opened my work software, and started putting together my response. I want to explain what I was thinking in that moment because the mindset matters a lot here. I was not trying to embarrass anyone for the sake of it. But what that management company letter represented was a credible, documented threat to place a fraudulent lien on a private property they had zero legal authority over. A lien is not a small thing. It can follow you when you try to sell your home. It can affect your ability to refinance. It creates legal complications that cost real money to untangle even when you are 100% in the right. I had given them multiple chances to discover and correct their own error. I had sent a certified letter, confirmed received, asking for basic proof of jurisdiction. They had ignored that letter completely and kept escalating anyway, so I was going to respond now, properly, thoroughly. The first thing I did was pull the county's public property records to identify every member of the HOA's board of directors. Their names and home addresses are public record in our state because HOA boards are required to register that information with the county. This is standard public information that anyone can find, and I have access to those county databases as part of my professional work. I also found the name and registered address of the president of the property management company. Then I built the package. I spent the better part of an evening putting it together, which is probably the most time I have ever voluntarily spent doing anything in my home office. But I wanted it to be airtight. I wanted every piece of information presented so clearly that there was no possible reading of it that left any wiggle room. I work with official documents for a living, and I know how easy it is to obscure things in the language if you want to. I wanted the opposite of that. I wanted clarity so sharp it was almost uncomfortable to look at directly. It was not a single letter. It was a complete, organized set of documents, printed cleanly and tabbed, sent via certified mail to every board member individually at their home addresses, and to the management company president at the company's registered office. I wanted it physically in the hands of every decision maker at the same time, not routed through whoever checks the general HOA mailbox. The cover letter opened by referencing the final notice before lien by its exact date and reference number. It stated very calmly that before forwarding the matter to legal counsel for review, I wanted to provide one final opportunity to resolve the situation internally. It directed the reader to the enclosed exhibits and explained what each one contained. The first exhibit was a simple table. Every violation notice in chronological order, the date received, the alleged infraction, and the fine amount. A running total at the bottom, underlined. Nothing emotional about it, just a clean record of what had been done and when. The second exhibit was a copy of the certified mail receipt and a copy of the letter I had sent months earlier requesting proof that my parcel was within their jurisdiction, along with the green return receipt card showing it had been delivered and signed for. This exhibit existed to demonstrate in documented form that I had asked this exact question at the very beginning and received zero response while the fines kept piling up. The third exhibit was the one I had been looking forward to putting together. It was a color-printed, high-resolution reproduction of the official county plat map for our area, produced using the professional mapping software I use for my actual job every day. The legal boundary of the neighboring HOA community was outlined in a thick red line. Every parcel inside the boundary was shaded lightly in red. My property was marked with a large green star. That star sat clearly, visibly, and undeniably outside the red boundary line. Not near it, not on the edge of it. Outside it, with an entire road and a buffer of trees sitting between my property and the nearest parcel that actually fell within their jurisdiction. Below the map, I had printed the relevant section of my title insurance documentation, the language that explicitly stated this property was not subject to any homeowners association covenants, conditions, or restrictions. I had highlighted that sentence in yellow. The closing section of the cover letter laid out exactly what I wanted. I wrote that the HOA and its agents had conducted a months-long pattern of sending violation notices and financial demands to a property that was not within their legal jurisdiction. I noted that my good faith certified request for proof of jurisdiction, confirmed received, had been ignored entirely while the fines escalated. I noted the specific date and approximate time when one of their agents had stood on the public sidewalk photographing my home. I wrote that the threat to place a lien on my property constituted an attempt to file a fraudulent encumbrance against real property they had no lawful authority over, and that this carried specific legal consequences under state law. I demanded 3 things: a formal written apology from the board, a written confirmation that all violation records associated with my address had been purged from their system and all fines voided to 0, and a written guarantee that no further contact, notices, or correspondence of any kind would be directed to my property. 10 business days to comply before the matter went to an attorney. I sealed the packages, addressed each one by hand, took them to the post office, paid for certified mail on each one, and drove home. Then I made dinner and sat on the couch with my wife, and, for the first time since that first notice had appeared in our mailbox months ago, felt completely at ease about how this was all going to end. The response came back in 3 days, not 10 business days. 3 calendar days. It came via express mail, which told me everything I needed to know before I even opened it. Express mail means urgency. Urgency means panic. Panic means that whatever I had put in those packages had landed exactly the way I intended. Inside the envelope was a letter from the HOA board president. It was apologetic in a way that read like someone writing under significant pressure. The letter acknowledged that a thorough review of their records had revealed that my property was not within the jurisdiction of their association. It expressed regret for any inconvenience this situation had caused. It confirmed in writing that all violation notices associated with my address had been removed from their system, that all accumulated fines had been voided to 0, and that no further correspondence would be directed to my address. Every single one of my 3 demands met in full, 3 days after I had asked. I read the letter twice, then placed it in the folder with everything else. The folder had gotten quite thick by that point. About a week later, I ran into one of the residents from the HOA community, someone I had chatted with a few times before, friendly in passing. We ended up talking for a few minutes in the street, and she brought up the HOA herself without me saying a word. She told me there had been an emergency board meeting a couple of weeks back and that it had been a tense one. The way she described it, the woman who ran the architectural review committee had been running the whole campaign against my property entirely on her own initiative, without ever properly verifying whether the property was actually within the community's boundaries. When those packages arrived simultaneously at every board member's home address and everyone opened them and looked at that plat map with the green star sitting clearly outside the red boundary line, the reaction had apparently been something close to chaos. The board members had been furious, not at me but at her, because she had created a real legal liability for the entire organization through months of sending threats to a property they had no authority over, and she had ignored a written certified request for proof of jurisdiction, rather than doing the 30 seconds of verification that would have ended the whole thing before it ever started. They had removed her from her position on the architectural review committee at that emergency meeting. And according to my neighbor, the combination of that public removal and the sheer humiliation of having everything laid out so precisely in front of everyone had apparently pushed the woman to list her house for sale. I said something appropriately neutral and got in my car. That afternoon, I went to a garden center and bought a flamingo, one of those classic pink plastic ones on a metal stake. I put it in the front lawn, positioned so it faced in the general direction of the community next door. It violates no city ordinance. It breaks no rule of any kind. It is simply a flamingo standing in my yard, cheerful and perfectly legal and completely untouchable. But I knew what it would have meant to someone who had spent months driving around in a golf cart photographing corn stalks and reindeer figures. I knew what it would have done to that person to see it standing there, bright pink and beyond any reach she had ever had over my property. It felt exactly right. I want to wrap this up by saying a few things that I think are genuinely worth knowing, not just about this specific situation, but about dealing with this kind of overreach in general. The first is that documentation matters more than most people realize until they actually need it. Not in a paranoid way. You are not expecting every dispute to turn into something serious. But the difference between saying something happened and proving something happened is entirely made of paper. I had dated notes, I had certified mail receipts, I had the return card, I had a timestamp note from the night I watched someone photograph my house from the sidewalk. When it came time to put the response together, I did not have to reconstruct anything from memory. I just opened the folder and had everything already laid out. The second is that the calmest, most factual response is almost always the most effective one. Not because staying calm is some kind of noble virtue performance, but because anger makes you imprecise, and imprecision gives the other side something to poke at. Every letter I sent was polite. Every request I made was reasonable. I never accused anyone of anything until I had documentation to back it up. By the time I sent that final package, there was nothing in it that could be called an exaggeration. It was just facts in order, with evidence attached. The third thing is the one that still stays with me. All of it happened because someone with a clipboard and a golf cart never thought to check a map. One look at the county parcel database, which is free and publicly accessible to literally anyone with an internet connection, would have shown them in 30 seconds that my address was outside their boundary. 30 seconds. That's all it would have taken to avoid the entire thing. But when you're used to having a little authority and no one ever pushes back on you, I think you stop asking whether you actually have the right to do what you're doing. You just do it, because it's always worked before. That assumption works fine right up until the day you aim it at someone whose entire professional life is spent knowing exactly where lines are drawn on maps. My flamingo has been in the yard for almost a year now. The house next door in the HOA community is still for sale. Every morning when I walk out to get the paper, I give it a little nod. For months, they tried to bully me into submission with fines and legal threats. They were so blinded by their small piece of authority that they never bothered to do the one thing they should have done first. Check a map. In the end, they didn't just lose the fight over my porch decor. They lost their star enforcer, their dignity, and came very close to losing a lot of money in a courtroom. And that flamingo stands guard to this day, a silent pink reminder that you should always be sure who you're picking a fight with. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This isn't my story, it was a close friend of a then-close friend. I'm not sure how I never thought about sharing it, as it is one of the best malicious compliance stories I've ever heard. There's also quite a bit of background here, mostly to explain old tech. This guy, we'll call him G, was pretty wealthy. Dude had a Napo job where he worked in a factory fixing the machinery which almost literally never broke. Someone always had to be on duty to be ready for repairs, so he got all kinds of overtime and was being paid almost $75 per hour in the early 2000s. To give you an idea of the kind of money he was making and how he didn't care, he spent most whole days sitting around watching movies on a personal laptop that he had spent over $2,000 on and just left it at his desk. If he had a call to the floor, it would take him no more than an hour, and that would happen maybe 3 times in a week. Holidays were 2.5 times pay, and he worked every one of them. This guy was a bit of a tech nerd, and he got an ISDN account as soon as it came out. For you youngins or folks who weren't savvy at the time, ISDN was basically 256.6 kilobits per second modems smushed together. This was back when 56.6K was as good as it got for residential, and you could still pay for slower, so fast AF for its day. Back in the days of dial-up, the dark ages, some services would be paid by the minute of usage, in addition to your monthly bill, and that's how this worked. Also, because dial-up was literal and used existing infrastructure, you could take your modem with you and use it somewhere else by logging into your account from a new location and dialing the closest number to you. This was also back in the day of long-distance charges. Now for the actual story. G just got his ISDN modem, and after a day or so took it to his brother's house one town over to show him how fast it was, and after they played around on the internet for a bit, G had to go to work and he would be doing some long shifts for the next couple of days, so his brother asked to borrow his modem, which G said was fine. I don't understand exactly how it happened, but his brother had signed into a long-distance number and then forget to shut the connection down. And then G got his first month's bill. It was over $14,000. He immediately called the service provider and explained the situation, and they basically told him, "You signed a contract, sucks to suck, we want our money." He relented and set up a payment plan. He would also be required to keep the contract going until the bill was fully paid. Now, if you've never even heard of ISDN, even if you're 30 plus years old, I don't blame you. This was a very short-lived technology and was replaced by DSL just a couple years later, but unlike ISDN, DSL required new infrastructure, and for some reason I don't fully understand, but I have guessed is probably the way some important switch on the service provider's network was set up. The two services could not coexist in the same small regions the size of like a neighborhood. And G lived in a pretty nice neighborhood, not mansions, but upper middle class. The best neighborhood our small town had to offer, in fact, and people just wanted DSL. It was the first time the internet was getting close to recognizable as it is today, because it was so much faster than what was previously available. The folks in this neighborhood wanted those speeds and did not like being told that they couldn't have it. So, service provider calls up G and explained the situation and offered to waive the remaining amount of the bill. G told him the whole bill was bullcrap and asked if they would refund what he had already paid, but they just told him to go duck himself. Malicious compliance. G tells him he has a contract and points out that they are obligated to fulfill their end of the contract and he will be paying his bill in full, and hung up. He keeps paying. Service provider keeps getting calls from more customers wanting DSL and folks who had previously calling back more and more irate. G gets another call, then another, until service provider decides to just tell people exactly who is responsible for their neighborhood's lack of DSL service. His neighbors let loose on him, but does G care? Not at all, just keeps paying his bill. This went on for more than a year. Eventually, service provider just decided to get rid of ISDN completely, as it was a legitimately outdated technology, and did forgive the remainder of G's bill since they weren't fulfilling their end of their contract, but the whole thing was just wonderful. The next one is an entitled people story, so it has once again become time for me to tell you all another tale from my many encountered with the entitled ones. This story takes place near the city of Kiruna in northern Sweden. It was mid-December of 2011, my second winter working as a snowmobile guide in the area. This winter, the weather had been cold, so all the lakes in the nearby Torn River were all frozen with plenty of ice, but we had had very little snowfall, only about 10 centimeters, 3/8 of a banana, on average in the forest, with the exemption of a couple of small ravines and small river canyons where some wind had blown up a thicker layer of snow. This is pretty unusual for the season, but obviously not something we had control over. And to legally be allowed to drive a snowmobile in the forest, you need to have no less than 30 centimeters, about 1.5 banana of snow. Thus, we were in a bit of a pickle about the snowmobile tours. Well, we put in some effort. We made brand new trails by shoveling snow into bad patches along a few ravines, and we were able to connect up the Torn River as well as a couple of lakes, and that way we were able to make quite a lot of easily drivable, safe, and legal snowmobile tracks. Now let's enter the stars of the show. A large Spanish family. They were several pretty much grown-up kids, a couple of middle-aged people, and a couple of older people. I don't remember the exact number, but they were more than 8 since I need another guide to help drive them to our starting spot since the car only takes 8. Anyway, we do the driving instructions, get everyone on the snowmobiles, and up we go. We drive along the river, up our trails, across a couple of lakes, out on the river again, and to an island in the river where we have dinner. Everything seems to be going well. People are generally happy and talkative, and they are all driving really well. We even managed to see a little bit of aurora. Then at the end of the tour, as we arrive back at the starting point, the dad, let's call him D, asks if he can go drive a bit in the forest. I tell him no, we only have the river, the lakes we saw, and those trails due to the snow conditions. Well, as it turns out, D is not the type of person that takes no for an answer, so he asks again, this time pointing out that he wants to drive in the forest. I tell him that he can do some free riding on the river if he wants, but I can't let him go driving in the forest because there is not enough snow. It's illegal, dangerous for the driver, damaging to the machine, and damaging to nature to do that. Note that even if there was more snow in the forest, we would not let beginners go free riding in the forest. They would just crash the machines into a tree. Well, D did not like that, and he absolutely loses it. He gets right up in my face, and about as close as he can be to my face without making physical contact, he screams as loudly as he can, "This is unacceptable!" I try to calm him down, but he is not having it. He keeps screaming that it's unacceptable. I ask him what I was supposed to do about it. He says nothing, but this is still unacceptable. He keeps going on and on about how it's unacceptable, the whole time screaming this right at my face. He starts demanding a refund, and at that I tell him he has to contact the office tomorrow if he wants a refund because I can't do a refund. Like we are standing on the edge of a frozen river in the middle of nowhere. And I am a guide. I don't deal with payments and reservations. I had no access to the payment systems nor the authority to issue any refunds. There is literally nothing I can do at this point. I just try to calm him down. Well, cue more screaming about it being unacceptable, and at this point he is almost as red as the bright red overall. The rest of the family slowly walks away back up to the parking lot where the other guide is now waiting with the second car to help me bring the group back. But this guy just will not stop screaming. After about 30 minutes of screaming, I eventually just tell this guy that I am leaving. If he doesn't shut up and get in the car, he is walking back to town. At this point, what I assume is his wife grabs him by the arm, says something in Spanish, and drags him to the car. He is completely silent on the way back, and I drop them off at the hotel, and they get out in silence, and off they go. When I get home, I send a message to the office explaining what happened just so they know what's up if Psycho calls. I was not a witness to the last part, but they did show up at the office and tried to shout the reception lady into submission, but the owner did not have any of that. They were apparently thrown out under the threat of the owner calling the police. As it turns out, they had booked the snowmobile trip in the office a day or two in advance, and they had been told about the snow situation and that we had limited trails when they booked the tour, and they had booked and paid anyway. Personally, I never saw them again. However, the lady at the reception told me the last part a few days later. So not only do I need to moderate everything anyone posts online and control the aurora with the flick of a wrist, I also need to be a weather god. Expect more stories in the future. Anyway, thank you for watching.